Hi there! Today's tutorial is about painting red poppies. So I will be sharing with you on how to use 3 different brushes to create various red poppy illustrations, and then followed by a much more detailed painting of red poppies at 3 different dimensions. So I will be demonstrating the simple illustrations of red poppies on an A5 sized watercolor paper, which is just about 200 grams per square meter of thickness. So since it's just a simple illustration, you don't really need a very thick watercolor paper. So the first brush that I'm going to use for this demonstration is my Da Vinci Casaneo mop version brush. It has a narrow tip and looks similar to a normal round brush, but it has got more hair or bristle. So this type of brushes are capable of holding more water and paint. So basically the size of the brush should not matter, because the main point is to show you how to paint the poppies based on the type of brushes, because each brushes has got its own characteristics. In a nutshell, it's about understanding the type of brushes and the results that it produces from the painting process, as well as finding the suitable brush for your painting style. So starting off with a nice mix of carmine red, I have started painting with the tip of the brush pointing inwards. As you can notice, I'll make a few versions of this brush movement so that you can somehow grasp what I'm doing on the screen. And starting off with the second illustration, you can see I am moving the brush forward and backward vertically. And in contrast to the first illustration, I just did one stroke and did not extend extra strokes. And as for the third illustration, I'm making smaller strokes but separate ones to create a distinguished petal. So basically this is an open bloomed poppy flower, which is viewed from a top view or aerial view, while the first 2 illustration is more of a side view. And right now I am dropping in the secondary color, which is of a bluish tint, using the tip of the brush. And once this part has been painted, I am sure you could visualize the flower petals even better. Now for the second method, this time I am pointing the tip of the brush outwards. So with the brush pointing outwards, I just drag the brush from left to right to create that smooth petal look. As you can see with the 5th illustration, I am just dragging it from left to right or from top to bottom. And in this particular illustration, I'm trying to create separate petals similar to the 3rd flower illustration. So basically, while you practice this, it's not any major brush strokes. It's small controlled movement, but you need to decide beforehand. And for the last illustration, I am applying hard pressure or pressing the entire brush bristle on the paper surface, and we'll have some rough textures which you can adjust with some minor brush strokes. So basically this is a bit rough way of painting, which is why I call it hard pressure. And if you want more rough textures, just reduce the amount of paint on the brush. And finishing off the poppy illustration by painting the stems using the rigger brush. So basically, if you have the similar brush as the Casaneo mop brush, try practicing painting the petals this way. So the second brush for this demonstration is a typical round brush, As I said earlier, size doesn't matter. And this brush is very common to most of the watercolor artists because it's quite versatile in painting most of the illustrations. And it's slightly thinner as compared to the mop type brush, so it holds less water or paint. So since this brush shares a similar shape with the first brush, I'm going to use the same technique. And starting off with the tip of the brush pointing inwards, and as I said in the first demonstration, I am applying the brush strokes back and forward. And as you make the brush strokes, you can create variations in the shape of the petal. You can make it look sharp or uneven so that the illustrations look more natural. And for the third poppy, I'm trying to create separate petals as in aerial view or top view, and I hope you can capture the brush strokes that I'm making. I don't wish to zoom in too much as it may pixelate the screen too much and you might not get a good view of the screen. So for the fourth poppy illustration, I'm using the second method similar to the first brush, whereby the brush tip is pointing outwards. And finally, the hard pressure method, where I am pressing the entire brush bristle on the paper. And I'm making two variations with this method just to compare and see the outcome. And the last one looks quite rough as I had lesser paint compared to the earlier one. And finishing off this illustration with the secondary color for the pistil part of the poppies as well as its stem. So how do you find the illustrations using the round brush? Do you see any similarities with the first brush? Well, might not see much difference. It is all in the process of painting which suits your hand movement the most. So the final brush for this demonstration is a typical flat brush. So since flat brushes hold a lesser amount of water and paint, definitely the result of this illustration would be contrast against the other two brushes that I used. And basically I am just applying strokes from left to right. As you can see now, it seems to be much easier to drag the brush since it's a very flat in shape. However, as I said, it doesn't hold much paint, so I have to keep loading in the colors before I make every strokes. So basically I just created a cone shaped petal, and for the third one I just started off by taking the brush strokes from top to the bottom. And remember to have variations in the petal shape so that it looks more natural. Just fiddle with your brush movements and angle. At the end of the day, the watercolor brush bristle is very soft, so as you make various movement and angle, you will realize how flexible your watercolor brushes can be. And finally, finishing off this illustration with the pistil as well as the stem painting. So how do you find the illustration so far using these three different brushes? Do you have any favorites? From my observation, the flat brush has actually produced very sharp or angular looking petals, while the round and mop brush has produced a much more flexible looking or soft looking petals. And with practice, you'll definitely grasp the movement of your brush as well as the angles that you use to create this type of illustrations. Now I managed to nail the poppy painting with minimal brush strokes. So next I am going to demonstrate on how to make a bigger illustration of the red poppies and at different dimensions. That includes top view, side view as well as diagonal. So the painting will be made on a bigger size paper, which is A4 size, and the thickness of the paper is 300 grams per square meter. So I have pre-mixed some cadmium red with the earlier carmine that I used for the small illustrations because I want it to look much brighter. And I'm using the Casaneo mop brush, holding it at an angle where the tip is pointed inwards, and I'm attempting to make two separate petals over here. As I explained earlier, I'm just moving the brush forward and backward while it's loaded fully with a nice mix of paint. And I thought of dropping in a little bit of Indian yellow towards the pistil part of the poppy as well as the petal areas. You can skip this color if you don't want to, but I always like to have more than one color in the flowers painting or any botanical illustration so that it looks more natural as it dries. And as for the bottom petals, I've decided to use more carmine red, which looks much darker than the one used for the top petals. I'm just painting it like an outline, trying to avoid the first petal that I painted earlier. Okay, so quite careful with the brush strokes. And after loading the brush with more paint, I'm repeating the same process on the opposite side of the petal. And you don't have to do it with one single brush stroke. You can keep loading in the paint and slowly making your brush strokes as long as it looks like a natural petal on a flower. And like I mentioned earlier, remember to have some variations in the brush strokes so that the petals pattern have some diversity and look more natural. So I'll leave that poppy painting to dry and move on with the next one, whereby I'm going to use the flat brush. And to start off, I am using once again more of cadmium red so that it looks much brighter in the first layer itself. So this is a front or side view of the poppy, and as you can see now, I am dragging the entire brush bristle from bottom to the top, trying to mimic a typical poppy petal that usually looks like a fan. And you can keep dropping in the cadmium red paint and reshape according to your liking, and make sure it doesn't look too perfect. As I said, it has to look more natural. And that's it. Now I'm adding some darker red. I'm trying to paint an overlooking petal from the right hand side as well as the top part. And since the color is much darker, you can definitely tell the different petals apart. And right now, using the mop brush, I'm just dropping in some of the Indian yellow mix that I had earlier. As for the pistil part of the flower, I have mixed some sapphire blue as well as some touch of indigo, and just dropping that in using my mop brush once again. And usually for smaller details like this, it is best to use a brush which has a fine tip. Next, I'm going to paint a diagonal view of the red poppy. A diagonal view means you can see about a quarter of the pistil area of the flower. And I am using the round brush to paint the petal. And for this particular view, I will have to make sure that the outer petals look more prominent. Therefore, I am not focused on the pistil part yet. So I'm painting the outer petals slowly. And I forgot to mention that I kick-started this petal with the cadmium red, which is brighter red as usual, followed by the carmine red, which is much darker. As I said, we're supposed to create variations in the colors so that we can distinguish the petals from each other. And as for the brush angle, I forgot to mention as well that it's pointing inwards as I make the brush strokes. So for the next petal, I've dropped in a little bit of ruby red to achieve much more darker red pigment, and painting that in a form of curve. And if you don't have another darker pigment of red, you can just add in a little bit of sapphire onto your carmine red so that you can achieve a slightly darker shade. And now for the fourth petal, once again with the brush angle pointing inwards, just dragging that, making an outline first. As I said, since this is a bigger illustration, you can make an outline and then later on drop in more paints as you make your brush strokes. Well, you can make some minor adjustments, as in dropping in a little bit of pigments here and there, as well as reshaping the petals. And now I'm just dropping in the dark blue mixes that I had earlier from the second poppy painting into the middle part or pistil area of the poppy, concentrating more on the top part of the flowers. As I said, this is a diagonal view, so you don't want the pistil part to have a perfect circle. Next, I'm dropping in some Indian yellow mix in the exact center. And since the second poppy flower, or the one in the center, looks almost perfect, I have decided to paint the stem using an olive green. And if you do not have an olive green shade, worry not, you can just mix some Indian yellow with a darker blue pigment, as in ultramarine blue or sapphire blue. Just mix these two colors in until you achieve the right color mix that resembles olive green. And I would say you will need more of the Indian yellow to achieve this color. I'm afraid lemon yellow or citron yellow might not be able to give you this olive green mix. And since the stem is going to be a fine line, so I'm using my rigger brush to paint in the stem. And while I'm painting the stem, I'm quickly painting in this hairy illustration on the poppy stem. As we all know, the common poppy usually has hairy stem. So you can use a smaller brush as well, as in a script brush, to paint in those fine lines or fine hairs on the poppy stem. Alright then, let's come back to the first poppy painting. And notice that small amount of Indian yellow that I applied has actually dried to be even brighter. And since this is a textured paper, I can notice some unique patterns on the poppy petals. So this point forward, I am going to apply the second layer of paint, starting off with the cadmium red, and using the same technique with the same mop brush. While I paint, I'm going to make some modification to the petal shapes. And with this, I have sped up the painting process so that the entire tutorial doesn't take too long to complete. And to accommodate the painting process, you can also move or turn your papers to the sides so that you can paint them easily instead of making too much of hand movements. And keep reshaping the petals according to your preferred look while the paint is still wet. And at this point of time, I've decided to drop in the dark blue mix to the pistil area of the poppy while the paint is still wet. As you can see here, it bleeds in profusely using my rigger brush. Moving on, I am going to paint the bottom petals using a much darker red mix. And since this is a second layer painting, so be mindful with your brush strokes, and this is the opportunity to correct mistakes that were created in the first layer. Now time to lift up some pigments in order to show the light areas or highlights on the petals, and you can do this by using a clean damp brush. I'm using the same mop brush, but I have washed it, and make sure there's not much water, it's just damp. So make sure to squeeze out your bristle before you proceed with this step. So just gently lift the pigments from the painting and dab it on the paper towel. And if you think there's too much pigment, you can rewash your brush and make it damp before you lift more pigments. So some of you might be wondering, why did I repaint it and then removing the excess pigment? That is because I feel I get a better visualization once all the colors are on the painting, while some artists would rather paint it part by part. I'd rather do it the other way. And secondly, the second layer of paint that I applied before lifting on the pigment actually gives the entire painting a boost, because the first layer painting was too transparent. So it's up to you which approach do you prefer in order to paint the highlights or make the highlights on your painting. It all comes with practice. Okay, it's time to paint the stem for this poppy. And this time I am using my script brush to paint those fine hair on the stem. Next, I'm going to make adjustments to the diagonal or the third poppy by adding in some dark areas. So I am going to apply some dark mix of red onto one corner on the petal, and then using a clean damp brush, I'm just going to move that pigment or glaze that color onto the rest of the petal area. So over here I am using my damp round brush. after damping or squeezing out the excess water on the paper towel, I'm just glazing that pigment that I applied using the mop brush, just giving it a glaze. Unfortunately, I can't do much justice on my recording. As you can see, there's a reflection of my light onto that particular painting. I hope you can see it on this part of the petal that I'm demonstrating now. As I said, after applying the red pigment using the mop brush, now I am using the round brush to just lightly glaze over that pigment. So I'm going to repeat this technique onto the other petals as well. Just use the tip of your brush to apply fine lines or thin lines of paint. Now just glazing over that paint that I applied. And in order to use this painting technique, it's advisable for you to use two different brushes. One would be to apply the paint, and the other is just a clean damp brush to do the glazing. And if you're going to rely on only one brush to use this technique, you have to keep washing your brush and reloading them with paint. And it is not advisable to do so, as the painting process can be hectic and lengthy. And now I am going to lift out some pigments from this petal using a flat brush. Why flat brush? It's because this particular petal is in a form of curve, which is giving an angular definition. So I thought the flat brush would be the best to lift out the pigment, because the flat brush has an even tip. So as I apply pressure onto the painting or the paper, it removes the entire pigment in a very angular form. Versus the round brush, I can't apply the same pressure throughout the entire paper. And while I lift out the pigment, I also get to blend in those hard lines as a result of the previous paint that has dried on the painting. Next, I am going to add in more details onto this third poppy by adding in some dark areas, and in order to do so, I have added some sapphire to my red mix, or my ruby red mix, to achieve a burgundy. And as usual, I am applying the paint mix with the tip of my mop brush, and then I will glaze that color onto the other parts of the petal using a round brush that is damp, just like in the previous sections. So observe the color that becomes more softened as I glaze the damp brush onto the pigment that I applied earlier. So this is one method of creating your dark areas on a painting. If you leave those paint without this glazing or softening method, I'm afraid it will form harsh lines once the painting is dry. So I am going to extend the maroon or burgundy mix color to paint the dark areas onto the top view poppy or the first poppy. Alright, time to paint the stem for the third poppy, as usual using my rigger brush and the olive green mix. I'm going to add some highlights onto the pastel part of the poppies by using white gouache mix. Now I realized that the middle poppy needs some dark areas as well. So I am going to apply some ruby red on top of this poppy. As usual, I am applying first the paint mix using my mop brush with some minor strokes just to show the petal shadows that can be seen from the inside of the flower under natural light or sun rays, and then followed by a glaze with the damp round brush. Adding in more dark pigments of red, as I felt the shadow should be even stronger than before. And just making some minor adjustments on the middle part of the poppy because I want that Indian yellow to show. And finally, as finishing touches, I am going to extend that dark red mix onto all the poppies by drawing in the petal veins using the script brush, as it produces a much more fine line. Not to forget a simple painting of the poppy bud and leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and complete this painting by adding in more details, as in background flowers and other wildflowers or weed. So you can continue watching. By the way, if you're interested in buying this painting, it will be up for sale on my Etsy store. And if you wait until the end of this video, there are another 2 more versions of the poppy paintings that I will share with you, as well as put it up on my Etsy shop. So here it is, the complete painting of the common poppy or red poppies. And the other two versions that I mentioned earlier in this video is this Iceland poppy, which is of red, yellow and orange tone, as well as oriental poppy, which is of purple tone. So basically all three paintings will be up for sale on my Etsy shop. And if you loved this tutorial, do share and give me a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to my channel if you're not yet a subscriber. I hope you will make an attempt to make this red poppy painting, and you can also tag me on social media, especially Instagram, or give me a mention. Hope to see you again on this channel. Thank you for watching.